We're going to be looking at the chronology of the divided kingdom in this particular session. Here's what we are planning to cover. We're going to be looking at some of the texts that we need to look at as we study this. We're going to be looking at some issues there are with chronologies, and there are indeed some issues. And I'll give you a possible solution. And we're going to look at sort of the dynasties in the southern and the northern kingdoms. So that is our goal. So we're going to begin by looking at the biblical texts that cover this period, and then go into the texts, put together a timeline for the time period. Now, I realize that chronology isn't the most exciting topic for most people. I happen to love chronologies. I happen to love timelines. So I always get to do these sessions, which is quite good. The book that was given out, by the way, very, very good book. This one, Rogues in Royal Robes by Monty White. Monty says this in this book. He says, maybe you don't like history and dates confuse you. Don't worry, you're in good company. I hated history in school and could not wait to give it up. This is Monty speaking, not me. So that I could devote more of my time to the study of sciences, which I loved. Yet when I became interested in the Bible, I realized that I had to try to understand much of the history that I read in the Old Testament. This was so that I could appreciate what was going on in the land of Israel, as well as the land of her neighbors, and which kings were reigning at the time when the prophets uttered their prophecies and their messages from God. If you understand all that, then it helps to put everything together in a framework. Now, many of the prophets who wrote were active during these time periods of the kings. And so there's a lot to glean from what they said about the kingdom they were writing to, about what was going on. So we can learn a lot from their writings as well. We'll be making references to that. So our primary texts to look at the divided kingdom, obviously, the book of Kings, without a doubt. Now, keeping in mind in Jewish scriptures, this was one book of Kings. There was not a first and a second as we have. It follows the history of the Israel's kings from the reign of Solomon, that's around about 971 BC, through the division of the kingdom under Rehoboam and Jeroboam, which Mark talked about, and to the captivity of both kingdoms. The north by Assyria, 721-23, someplace in there BC, and the south by Babylon in 586. And it concluded with a mention of one of the kings of Judah in captivity many years later. And that's about 560. So really, the book of Kings, our first and second Kings, goes from about 971 to about 560. So it covers, just over 400 years of time period. And it's amazing. You can sit down and read it in a day without any problem, and yet you've covered that much time period. Of course, it also includes details about Elijah and Elisha. And there's quite a few chapters in our second Kings, beginning of that's devoted to them. Into First Kings deals some with Elijah as well. Now, as far as who wrote it, we simply don't know. It doesn't specify it. Some Jewish traditions ascribe it to Jeremiah, probably due to there's bits of the book of Jeremiah are very much identical to the Kings. Having said that, we could say that about Isaiah as well. So, but Josephus ascribed it to the prophets. And I think he may not be far off there. I think that's sort of the idea. There are references within the books of Kings to other records that were kept about the reigns of the kings. We've got in 1 Kings 11:41, there's a book called the Annals or the Acts of Solomon. We have no idea what that is, but that was a book, and that was kept. There is one in 1 Chronicles 14:19, referred to as the Annals or the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. So these aren't the only accounts of their reigns that were being written at the time. These are the ones that God has preserved for us. As the book in Hebrew is grouped with the former prophets. Maybe it's safe to assume that this was a result of the writing of the various prophets, often referred to as a school of prophets. So maybe they were the ones involved in it. First 9 chapters deals with the reign of Solomon. Of course, we've already seen that. Then I mentioned the annals. No, I forgot to mention the annals of the Acts, the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. That's another book as well. So forgot to throw that one in there. But as the title suggests, it deals with the kings of both kingdoms. So books of Kings, North Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom, both dealt with. And that by itself makes it a bit difficult sometimes to figure out where we are and what's going on, because it will flick backwards and forwards. And so that's useful. When I've taught these books in congregations in times past, what I did was taught all the way up through Solomon. Then I taught the Northern Kingdom by itself. Then I taught the Southern Kingdom by itself. So you get the general history of both. To an extent, we're doing some of that this week because we've sort of separated the two. And I think that's more useful. It's also helpful to have a knowledge of the geography of the land and what's where, and that's always very, very useful. It's important to know, did this event take place in the north or in the south? Is it in Judah or is it in Israel, Ephraim, Samaria, whichever term you want to use for the northern kingdom? So that's useful. It helps to distinguish what is going on. So there's that. Then there's the book of Chronicles. And again, in the Jewish scriptures, this was one book. Must have been a very long one, but it was one book. It was divided, by the way, into two when the Septuagint was translated from Hebrew into Greek. And that's where we could get those divisions. In our English Bible, we classify this as a book of history. But in the Jewish scriptures, it's placed separately from Samuel and Kings, and it's referred to as part of the writings, the Ketuvim. So that's where it goes. It's actually the very last book of the Jewish scriptures. So it ends with the end of Chronicles, and that's the very end. So that's sort of interesting. By the way, that reflects some of what Jesus says when he talks about you killed from this person to this person. It's actually from Genesis to 2 Chronicles, from the beginning to the end. So it does make sense when you understand the Jewish collection is quite a bit different than the other. I meant to bring my Jewish scripture, the Old Testament in English, of course, with me, because it has it in the order that it would have been, but I forgot to bring it. So that's a page from it, by the way. So you can see it in Hebrew there at the top. Reading, of course, from right to left. I have no idea what it says, but anyway, that's what we have there. But all that's going on there. Our name comes from a suggestion by Jerome, who's a Latin writer, translator. And so our name, Chronicles, comes from Jerome. Again, we don't know who wrote it. Jewish tradition ascribed it to Ezra. Why? Because the last few verses are identical to the first few verses, or pretty similar to the first few verses of Ezra. And so I thought, it must have been Ezra. Well, maybe not. It would seem that it wasn't him, to be totally honest. He may be the compiler of the chronology that's found in the first 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles, and that's a possibility there. But the suggestion is maybe it was written by the priests. And the reason that suggestion is that it deals with all it's concerned with is how it affects the worship in the temple. And so that's its focus in the Chronicles. Just as there were other sources that are referenced in the Kings, there is that in the Chronicles as well. So there are the Chronicles of the various prophets, such as what we have here, Shemaiah, Iddo, Jehu, not the king, but the prophet. There's 2 different ones, so be careful of that. But it references other prophets that were writing, so that's interesting as well. And it also references both the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel and the chronicles of the seers, which is interesting. Maybe that's indicating that some of what we have is from the prophets. Could be there too. Don't know. But we simply don't know who wrote it at all. But all sorts of things as you read through it, you'll see there. Our first Chronicles deals with the genealogy, lots of genealogies actually, including David, and records David's first reign. First 11 chapters of our second Chronicles deals with Solomon, then the division of the kingdom from chapters 12 to 36. But what it has in there is a different type of history than the Kings. This deals with, as I mentioned, the temple, and it's the worship that goes on there. So the history is more of a religious history. And as such, because the Northern Kingdom didn't have anything to do with the temple, Northern Kingdom is not listed. It's just the history of the Southern Kingdom. Now, there is the times when they intersect where you'll see them coming in, but it doesn't deal with the actual kings of the north, only the kings of Judah. So it's a history, and some suggest, and I think it's got a lot going for it, a history from a priest's point of view, a priest standpoint, more interested in how faithful the kings were to God and to the temple. And we'll see that although Manasseh was probably the worst of the kings of Judah, the Chronicles also record that he changed and came back to following God. You don't read that in the Kings, but you read that in the Chronicles. We'll get to that when we look at Manasseh. In his commentary on 2 Chronicles, a chap named Raymond Dillard said, Jerome wrote, the book of Chronicles, the epitome of the old dispensation, is of such importance that without it, anyone who claims to have a knowledge of the scriptures makes himself a fool. In many ways, I assent to Jerome's insight. The Chronicles are extraordinarily rich and replay many-fold the effort invested to understand them. It's to be regretted that the Chronicles remain a neglected book in the church. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good comment that Mr. Dillard made. Yeah, it is important, and it's important especially as we talk about the Messiah and the lineage and going on to here. That's what Chronicles really helps to encapsulate. Now, the other texts we have are what's called the books of the prophets. Many of the prophets were active during this time. Some of these don't seem to have written anything, at least anything that's been preserved, apart from any contributions they had to the text of the Kings, which of course is anonymous. Lots of prophets mentioned. There's prophets in the northern kingdom. A chap named Ahiah, we've already been introduced to. An old prophet in Bethel in 1 Kings 13. The prophet Jehu, not the king, but the prophet in 1 Kings 16. Obadiah is mentioned in chapter 18. Elijah, and of course, Elisha. Micaiah in chapter 22. And Oded in 2 Chronicles 28. And lots of unnamed prophets. So there were a lot of prophets going on in this era. In the south, we had a prophet named Shemaiah. He wrote, by the way, but not a book that we have. He's mentioned in 2 Chronicles 12, Nathan, 2 Chronicles 29, and lots of other unnamed ones. Quite a few more mentioned in connection with the northern kingdom than in Judah. Maybe it's because the northern kingdom left following God so early on, and God was sending the prophets to bring them back. Maybe that's the answer to that. But prophets who wrote during this time period that we have give details, as I mentioned, of the condition in both kingdoms, and in particular, what they were doing in relationship with the people of God, or rather sometimes what the people of God weren't doing in relation to God. So just running down through the prophets just very, very quickly. Joel, we don't know when Joel's written. We don't have much about him. He seems to have been from Judah. Possibly they suggest from Jerusalem. He doesn't mention any kings. He doesn't mention any specific historical events, so it makes it very difficult to date what he wrote, although many place it before the reign of Ahaz. While internal evidence might suggest it was written during the early years of Joash. So that's a possibility. But he was possibly the earliest of the writing prophets. He talks about a locust plague. He talks about drought. he talks about famine. So if you want to have a flavor of what these things did to the nations, read Joel. He talks about that and what the people had to go through. But that could apply pretty much to any kingdom during that time period. So we don't have any specifics there. They say he most likely wrote to Judah. There's Jonah. We know Jonah from his book of Jonah. But he lived during the reign of Jeroboam the second Jeroboam. In the north, Uzziah in the south. Makes him contemporary with Hosea and Amos during their early work, and Isaiah in Judah. So all these are going on at the same time period. It's assumed that he wrote the book that bears his name, which talks about God's impending judgment on Nineveh. That's on Assyria, which we'll learn more about Assyria very soon. And he's mentioned, though, in the text of Kings, in 2 Kings 14:25. And there he's referred to as a servant and prophet of the God of Israel. So he is mentioned in the text, but he's got his own book. There's Hosea, a prophet to the north, during the reign of Jeroboam II, maybe those who came just immediately after him. He's active until just before the fall of Samaria. Again, contemporary with Isaiah, contemporary with Micah in the south, overlapping that of Amos in particular in the north. Then that leads us very nicely to Amos, same time period, Jeroboam II, as well as Uzziah, prophet to the north, but originally from the south. So he's from Judah, but he was a prophet to the northern kingdom. He prophesied during the reign of Jeroboam II. I mentioned that. This was, by the way, was a time of great prosperity for the northern kingdom. But even though they were prosperous, spiritually they were bankrupt. They just were not following God. One writer referred to that time period as the Indian summer of the northern kingdom. Sort of the last bright bit, at least as far as the nation was concerned, not spiritually. Isaiah, of course, has a huge book that he wrote. He's mentioned in the text as well of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. He's a prophet to Judah under the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So he has quite a few overlapping there. Some of what's found in 2 Kings is word for word what we found in Isaiah. Suggested that he at least contributed to the book of Kings. Micah, contemporary of in the south of Isaiah, during the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, place him slightly later but contemporary with Isaiah. He's from a place called Moresheth, about 20 miles southwest of Jerusalem, on the border of the Philistines near Gath is where he was from. And he's mentioned as well in Jeremiah 26 as prophesying during the days of Hezekiah. So he's got a reference elsewhere. But his prophecy again directed to Judah in particular. There's Nahum. Don't know much about him. His hometown may have been in the northern kingdom, although he may have lived in Judah. We just don't know. The prophecy deals with the fall of Nineveh. It deals with the Assyrian nation. And it places the date anywhere from between 663 and 612 BC, the first date from his mention of the destruction of Thebes. It's thought that he might have written during the reign of Joash. Others suggest maybe he wrote towards the end of the reign of Manasseh, but he most likely overlapped some of the time of Jeremiah as well. Seems to have been written for Judah, although it's about Nineveh. Assyria is going to fall, was what it was talking about. We'll get there. And then there's Zephaniah. Zephaniah wrote to Judah during the reign of Josiah. Again, it would have been a contemporary of Nahum and Jeremiah. Of course, there's Jeremiah himself. Jeremiah is mentioned in the text of 2 Chronicles. He wrote the book which carries his name, prophet to Judah under the reigns of Joash, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah. And if you recognize those names, and you may not yet, but you will, those are the last kings of Judah. So he's active during all of that, even beyond the destruction of Jerusalem. Some of what is found in 2 Kings, again, is word for word what we find in Jeremiah, which suggests maybe he also contributed to the book of Kings. He also wrote Lamentations, an acrostic poem written after Jerusalem's destruction. But the end of Jeremiah detailed what happened after the third exile of the people to Babylon. And then there's Habakkuk, from Judah, wrote to Judah, was a contemporary of Jeremiah, and most likely wrote during the reign of Jehoiakim. The writings in the form of a series of questions to God. Why are you allowing them and their dreadful people to do that to us? We're your people. So that's what he sort of approaches there. But it details the questions and then God's answer about the impending destruction of Jerusalem. Ezekiel occurs during the last time frame of Judah, although they are in exile. There were 3 exiles, we'll see that. But contemporary of Jeremiah, although he's in exile and prophesying to those in exile. So he was in the second deportation to Babylon. But he gives some good summaries of what was happening in Judah at the end of Zedekiah's reign. So he can give us a good flavor of what's going on back home. Daniel, of course, again, contemporary of both Jeremiah and Ezekiel, also in exile. And he's detailing some of the conditions the Jews faced as they headed towards the fall of Jerusalem. He's part of that first deportation to Babylon. Early in Nebuchadnezzar's reign, although he continued into the overthrow of Babylon by the Medes and Persians, and was active under their reigns as well. And then there is Obadiah. I don't know much about Obadiah other than he wrote this vision, 1 chapter, it's short. Deals with Edom and their animosity towards Judah. Now that gives us a couple of different dates that scholars give for this. Some date it during the reign of Jehoram, contemporary with 2 Kings 8, which mentions Edom's revolt against Judah and coming out of being under their rule. And some give it a date that was written during Babylon's attack on Jerusalem, leading to its destruction. I happen to like that date because I think it sort of fits that time period of what was happening. But if that's the case, it would make him a contemporary of Jeremiah. But the prophets, reading through them, give us an ideal background to what's going on in both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, depending on which they were written to. We can see a lot of what's going on. So they should be examined if you're doing a study of 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles. It's bringing in the prophets as well. So just to summarize what I just said there, we've got a couple prophets specifically to the north. We've got some prophets to Judah, and actually it looks like you've got more prophets to Judah, interestingly, although there's a lot of other prophets that are mentioned for the north, but they weren't writing prophets. And then, of course, you've got those who had messages for other nations. Jonah and Nahum talking about Assyria, and Obadiah talking about Edom. So those are our prophets there. Okay, this is the fun bit now. Chronology. There are some issues with chronology. One of the problems in dating the history of the 2 kingdoms, you don't have any actual dates in the text. Okay, it makes it sort of difficult there. And add to this that some of the kings had more than one name. And you'll change names and not realize you're talking about the same person. So you've got that issue. And add to that sometimes different kings had the same name. And that's not useful. And sometimes there's the name in the north and there's a name in the south, but they're not the same person. And so you've got to be able to figure out who you're talking about. Now, the source that I have followed for many years, as did Monty White in Rogues, is that of Edwin Thiele. Edwin Thiele wrote a book back in 1951 called The Mysterious Number of the Hebrew Kings. Actually, it was his doctoral dissertation, which he then was later on published. But it's based, he was trying to work out how you can fit in all the kings within the time frames that we have, which is destruction of Babylon in particular, or not Babylon, the destruction of Judah by Babylon, and of course the end of Solomon's reign. So he's trying to figure out how to do that. And one of the problems is if you put the numbers we're given in text end to end, you get way too much time. By the way, you do that with Egypt as well. And most of the time, our scholars for Egypt put it back to back, and it gives you way more time than you've got allocated for that. And so they end up with bad numbers. And this ends up bad numbers if you do that in the Old Testament as well. So he based his dating on two events. It bases it on Ahab, because he's recorded in something called the Kirk, K-U-R, I think it's K-H, Stele, S-T-E-L-E, basically a piece of stone that's been engraved, which records the Assyrian advance into Israel and Judah, and we can date that particular monument, and also on Jehu being depicted on the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, paying tribute to Assyria. And his conclusion was that Ahab's events took place in the last year of his reign, while Jehu's paying tribute took place on the first year of his reign. So by taking those as his two dates, he's able to get the dates given for the reigns of the northern kingdom to align with the dates given for the southern kingdom. And that was a problem before the 1950s. Monty White writes about this. You can read about it in his book. He says, basically, Professor Thiel accomplished two outstanding feats. Firstly, he established a single chronology for both the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah that got rid of all the apparent discrepancies that existed between the chronologies of these two kingdoms. And secondly, he locked this chronology into the established chronologies fixed by modern astronomical records of the surrounding countries, notably those of Assyria and Babylon. See, that's very helpful, is that the Assyria and Babylon have recorded things like eclipses and things. Those can be dated with precision because it only happens every so often. So by taking their records and then their records referring back to the northern kings, you can start establishing things. So that's what he did. I'm glad he did it because I would hate to have done that. So I'm sure glad that he spent the time. The only dates he could not get to align were that of Hezekiah of Judah and Hoshea of Israel. Subsequent researchers have realized that Hezekiah's reign probably overlapped that of Ahaz. And if you realize that, the dates do align. So that seems to be the
Would it have been possible to have more than one king?
We'll get to
How
that.
there was prior?
We'll get to that. Absolutely. Absolutely. Rival kings. Northern kingdom especially. Yeah, rival kings. Yeah, that's part of the problem as well, which you've got to take into consideration. One of the issues as well is, when did the reign start? Several problems making out chronology. As I mentioned, if the reigns are placed end to end, it takes more time than we have in history. So the conclusion is that many, if not most of the kings, actually many is better, overlap their reigns with their father and or their sons. And so one would be on the throne, so the co-regency, they call it, as one is going out, the other is coming in. It might be due, by the way, to illnesses or other things that are happening as a result. So all that's going on. By the way, we see that in David and Solomon as well, because David has Solomon on the throne before he dies. And so we know that was something that did happen.
And it was Absalom as well.
What's that, sorry?
It was Absalom that overthrew David.
Yeah, he's never counted as one of the kings, though. It's still David's reign.
David called him king, so in the records, potentially they could have put David and Absalom.
But he's never listed because he was a usurper, and David was still reigning. So, but yeah, that could be that as well. So, and there's another bit that happens here. It's the way the kingdoms marked the dates. Now that doesn't help. Now this is very technical. You can read about it in Monty White's book. Okay, the Northern Kingdom used what's called the non-accession year system. By the way, I think I need to go. It may go something else. I'll come back to that. I forgot to eliminate that. These are the overlapping reigns. This is from Monty White's book. These are the overlapping reigns that we know of. Okay, We've got rival kings there in Omri and somebody, Tibni, I think it says, where Israel's divided into two parts, the northern kingdom. So we got rival kings. So we know that one. Jehoash and Jeroboam II overlapped. Menahem and Pekah overlapped. We'll talk about that one in a minute. Again, rival kings going on there in the north. And then the southern kingdom, it's not rival kings there, but it is one starting to reign before the next one. Asa and Jehoshaphat and Jehoram, Amaziah and Ahaziah, who's also known as Uzziah, Azariah, Jotham and Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh. We know those are overlapping reigns. So, and then that's in your book. So I thought that'd be useful. Okay, let's talk about the way the kings marked their dates. This is something Thiel discovered. The northern kingdom used what's called a non-accession year system. Now, what that means is his first year of reign began the day he took the throne. So if it was a month from now, he was said to have reigned a year, although he's only reigned a month. Okay? They counted that, any time in that first year as a year. And by the way, that meant that if a king only reigned 2 months, but those 2 months were in 2 different years, he'd be listed as reigning 2 years because he's in this year and this year. So that's the way they did it. It was the year. Okay? Western thinking doesn't work that way. My mind definitely does not work that way. But that's the way they did it. So keep that in mind. Southern Kingdom used what was called an accession year system. So it wasn't until the first day of the next calendar year that he's reigned a year. And then the next calendar year, he's reigned second year. So they did it more like we would do it. Which to me makes a whole lot more sense. But if we understand that the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom are working on 2 different systems, that helps us to make sense of the dates that we're given. By the way, in addition to the dates that Thiel knew we could trust historically, I believe the beginning and end dates are fairly accurate. Due to archaeology that we have during Solomon's reign, we can date Solomon, and of course we can date Judah's captivity. And so using those as endpoints and filling everything else in with what he has, you can be pretty confident of the dates. So what's the chronology? Tighten your seatbelts, because here we go. Okay, there's our timeline. We've got to have the northern kingdom in the north, of course. The southern kingdom in the south, of course. We'll do the northern kingdom first. Of course, Jeroboam is the first king of the northern kingdom. He led the nation into idolatry, which they never left. We'll get to that, by the way. Reigned for 22 years, so that's approximately 22 years on our timeline, 931 to about 910 BC. He's followed by his son Nadab. Ooh, that's a short reign, isn't it? I couldn't even stick it down there because you couldn't see it otherwise. So Nadab, 2 years. He's assassinated by Baasha. Baasha is the third king. He reigns for 24 years. 909 to 886, his son Elah, again a short reign. The fourth king reigned for 2 years. And guess what? He was assassinated. Boy, you got a lot of assassination going on up in the northern kingdom. He was assassinated by Zimri. Wow, look at his. It's even shorter. Zimri was the commander of Elah's army. His reign was really brief, by the way. 7 days. 1 week. And he committed suicide. Because Omri, which was the other commander of the army, captured his town in 885. So he commits suicide, so he's not captured, assassinated. So he chooses that. So Omri is known in the secular writings as one of the greatest kings of Israel. But he only reigned 12 years, 885 to 874 BC. Omri, we know his name historically from the Black Obelisk down in the British Museum. He's on other records as well, but his name's mentioned there, although it's not him that's depicted. He's succeeded by his son Ahab, who ruled for 22 years. So Ahab had quite a decent long rule. Not decent rule, but he had a long rule. 874 to 853. Ahab, if you remember, died in battle when struck by an arrow when he was disguised as a regular soldier. Can't thwart God. But that's what happened there. We'll look at that tomorrow at some point or the next day. His son Ahaziah becomes the 8th king. Again, very short reign. He ruled for 2 years, and then he dies, and his brother Jehoram, or Joram, he's referred to as both in the text, also a son of Ahab, becomes the 9th king. He reigns for 12 years, and he's killed by Jehu, who was, looks like the commander of his army. Jehu then reigns for 28 years. By the way, that's the longest so far in the north, 28 years. And he's the one who's actually depicted on the black obelisk down in the British Museum. We'll see that later on. He's succeeded by his son Jehoahaz, who reigns for 17 years, so still a decently long reign. His son, the 12th king, was Jehoash, or Joash. Again, both spellings can be used. He reigns for 16 years. So we got maybe a degree of stability going on here. 22, 17, 16 years. And then it's his son Jeroboam. We usually call him Jeroboam II because we've already had one. So his son Jeroboam reigns for 41 years. That's the longest of the southern kings, or the northern kings, 41 years. He seems to have co-reigned with his father during some of that. Hence, we have a slight overlap there on our timeline. By the way, during his reign, Jonah is active. So there's Jonah up there at the top. And we also have Hosea, and we also have Amos. So all of them are active during that time period. He's succeeded by his son, Zechariah. Now, you're going to love Zechariah. Boop. 6 months. Very short. Guess what happened? Assassinated. Yeah, you're learning very, very quickly. Yes, he assassinated by Shallum. So guess who the next king is? Shallum. You kill off one, you get to become king. Shallum only reigns 1 month. Okay, so, and guess what happened to him? Assassinated again. He's assassinated by Menahem. So he's the next king, and he reigns for 10 years. So he has a bit longer reign, and he's succeeded by his son Pekahiah, who reigns for 2 years, and before being assassinated by Pekah. Now, the text says that Pekah reigned for 20 years, but it looks like this is the rival kingdoms going on. It looks like some were following him from the time of Menahem's reign, and then he reigns through that. So that's where his 20 years come in. And that seemed to be the best idea. Others have suggested that he was the power behind Menahem and Pekahiah. And that's why it's saying that he reigned for 20 years. But I think it's probably rivals, because that makes more sense in the text there. So he reigns, absolute reign probably from 743 to 732, about 9 years, but a total of 20 years where there's some sort of a split going on there. And he's succeeded by the last and final king, 19th king, called Hoshea. And Hoshea reigned for 9 years, and he was overthrown by Assyria. So that's the end of the northern kingdom. So, whop, it's done. So that's the northern kings. You see how they're nicely outlined there? Really works out pretty well, doesn't it? By the way, if you want copies of any of this, I can supply that. I found these. Once I knew that was going to take me forever to put together. I haven't done the Southern Kings yet, but it took me forever to put it together. I thought, this is useful. So I've got it if you want it. Southern Kings, again, it's going to go on at the same time as the Northern Kings, is it not? So Southern Kings, we've got the first king, of course, being, I don't know where that red line came from. I forget, it'll show up again where it's shooting where it's supposed to go. I forgot to have it work its way in. We've got Rehoboam, son of Solomon. Mark talked about him. Became king at Solomon's death. And of course, the kingdom divided due to his harsh practices, as well as God's decision. He rules for 17 years, so not quite as long as Jeroboam. And he was replaced by his son, Abiah. And Abiah reigns for just a very few, for 3 years. By the way, all the kings of the northern kingdom were not faithful to God. I mean, that's just flat out. They were all followed after Jeroboam to one degree or another. Southern, it sort of flips backwards and forwards, and some faithful, some unfaithful, some marginally faithful. So you've got a bit of a split there in the southern kingdom. But they're a bit of a mixed bag. The text always tells us how faithful they were. By the way, no statement about Rehoboam in the text at all, except that it says that what it says about Abiah following in his sinful practices. So it seems like he did wander off fairly early. The nation drifts further into idolatry under Rehoboam's reign. Abiah rules for 3 years, followed all the sinful practices of his father. He was not wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord his God as his ancestor David had been, the text tells us in 1 Kings 15. He's succeeded by his son Asa. Asa, wow, that's a good one. By the way, I put Asa in purple. He's a good king, okay? Asa, he had a 41-year reign. Text tells us, again, 1 Kings 15, Asa did what the Lord approved as his ancestor David had done. But the high places were not eliminated, yet Asa was wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord throughout his lifetime. So he follows God, doesn't quite eliminate idolatry, but he follows God. His son Jehoshaphat became the next king. And again, I put him in purple. He's a good one. He's a good king. Jehoshaphat, 25 years. The text tells us in 1 Kings 22, he followed in his father Asa's footsteps and was careful to do what the Lord approved. However, the high places were not eliminated. The people continued to offer sacrifices and burn incense on the high places. Jehoshaphat was also at peace with the king of Israel. We'll talk about that in my next lesson as well. His son Jehoram succeeds him. He's a different color. There you go. There's Ahaziah. I knew I had these things. I thought I had it all programmed right, but it didn't quite. But nevertheless, it'll come out right at the end. So Jehoram reigned for 8 years. And it says he followed in the footsteps of the kings of Israel. Not good. Just as Ahab's dynasty had done, for he married Ahab's daughter. Mark talked about all of Solomon's wives and leading them into idolatry. His wife did too. So, she's the usurper, by the way, as well. So he did evil in the sight of the Lord. During his reign, Edom freed themselves from Judah's control. He's succeeded by Ahaziah, who reigned for 1 year. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself because I don't have this thing programmed right. But anyway, Ahaziah reigned for 1 year. He followed the footsteps of Ahab's dynasty, did evil in the sight of the Lord as Ahab's dynasty had done, for he was related to Ahab's family. You got a lot of influence of Ahab going on there. He sided with Israel's king Joram, and he was shot by Jehu, escaped to Megiddo, and died there. At this stage, his mother, Athaliah, daughter of Ahab, usurped the throne. Athaliah killed all the sons of Ahaziah so that she could become queen, or at least she thought she killed them all. I guess maybe he had so many she couldn't keep track of them. But anyway, one of them was, one remaining grandson was hidden in the temple. And it doesn't look like she had much time for worshiping God because she never found him in the temple. So she must not have gone in there. So anyway, in her 7th year, the high priest Jehoiada instigated a coup that resulted in Athaliah's execution and Ahaziah's remaining son then becoming king. So that is Josiah. No, Joash. Sorry, not Josiah. We'll get to Josiah in a minute. Joash. Joash became king at the age of 7. So I'm not sure whether his reign includes that of his grandmother or not. I'm not sure how that is. I've listed them separately, so it fits separately. But he reigns for 40 years. Text tells us, 2 Kings 12:2, and he's also known as Jehoash, just to confuse us, because there's a northern king that's known as that as well. But Jehoash did what was the Lord approved in all his days, when Jehoiada the priest taught him. But the high places were not eliminated. The people continued to offer sacrifices and burn incense on the high places. One thing he did was to repair the temple. Because of all these well, actually it's not all that many years of bad kings, but the temple's in quite a state of disarray and needs to be renovated. So they do some renovation in the temple. He repairs it. He's later murdered by his servants at Beth Millo, was replaced by his son Amaziah. And it's thought that Joel, if he's writing to the southern, might have taken place during that particular reign. That's one of the possibilities. Amaziah reigns for 29 years. It's purple, so I should tell you he's a pretty good king overall. He did what the Lord approved, the text tells us, 2 Kings 14, but not like David, his ancestor, had done. So he's faithful, but not as faithful as David. So maybe we should have another color, maybe a striped color or something in there. He followed the example of his father Joash, but the high places were not eliminated. The people continued to offer sacrifices and burn incense on the high places. Do you notice the theme going on here? They may be faithful in their service in the temple, but they're not eliminating all the idolatry. The people are still worshiping on high places, which is what they did, had shrines to various gods. They're still doing that, and he's allowing that to continue. He, too, was assassinated, succeeded by his son, Azariah, also known as Uzziah. By the way, but notice how much overlap we've got there? And that seems to be accurate. Uzziah has a 52-year reign, but it looks like a lot of that's an overlapping reign. He did what the Lord approved, 2 Kings 15, just as his father Amaziah had done. Not as David had done, but as Amaziah. You notice that. But the high places were not eliminated. The people continued to offer sacrifices and burn incense on the high places. When he died, he was succeeded by his son Jotham. And again, sorry, I didn't get those programmed right. Jotham also has an overlapping reign. Jotham, 16 years. And it says he did what the Lord approved, just as his father Uzziah had done. So we're not going back to David yet. Just so there is a degree of faithfulness there. High places not eliminated. People continue to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings. His son Ahaz is the next king. You notice he's back to the red color. Not a good king. Ahaz, 16-year reign. He did not do what pleased the Lord his God, in contrast to his ancestor David. He followed in the footsteps of the kings of Israel. The kings of Israel had a lot of influence on Judah. Should have been the other way around, by the way. He passed his son through the fire. A horrible sin practiced by the nations whom the Lord drove out before the Israelites. He offered sacrifices, burned incense on the high places, on the hills, and under every green tree. So, not a good king. He's succeeded by his son Hezekiah. Hezekiah has a 29-year reign. He did what the Lord approved, just as his ancestor David had done. You've been waiting for David to pop back in. So this is a good guy. He eliminated the high places, smashed the sacred pillars to bits, cut down the Asherah pole. He also demolished the bronze serpent that Moses had made. For up to that time, the Israelites had been offering incense to it. It was called Nehushtan. He trusted in the Lord God of Israel. In this regard, there was none like him among the kings of Judah, either before or after. He's a high point, without a doubt. Loyal to the Lord and did not abandon him. He obeyed the commandments that the Lord had given to Moses. The Lord was with him. He succeeded in all his endeavors. That's 2 Kings 18. Isaiah, by the way, very influential during his reign. We see him active there. Micah also active. He built a wall extending the protection of Jerusalem, as well as a tunnel to bring water into the city. We'll see those later. And when he died, he's succeeded by his son Manasseh. Sorry, it's jumped ahead of me again. So Manasseh again, longest serving king, becomes king at age 12. Probably a bit of an overlapping reign with Hezekiah. Reigns for 55 years, over half a century. From what we can tell, the first 10 years was co-ruler with Hezekiah. And it says about him in 2 Kings, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, committed the same horrible sins practiced by the nations whom the Lord drove out before the Israelites. He rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had destroyed, so he put them back. He set up altars for Baal, made an Asherah pole, just as King Ahab of Israel had done. He bowed down to all the stars in the sky and worshipped them. Not a good guy. But 2 Chronicles 34 records that he was captured by the Assyrians, and while a prisoner in Babylon, he humbled himself, prayed to God, was restored to his kingdom, where he then got rid of the foreign gods. So he seems to have done it, put them back, and then he took them back away as well. He died and was succeeded by his son Ammon, who only had a 2-year reign. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, just as his father Manasseh had done. At least the initial part, this is from 2 Kings. He followed in the footsteps of his father and worshipped and bowed down to the disgusting idols that his father had worshipped. He abandoned the Lord, God of his ancestors, did not follow the Lord's instructions. He was assassinated by his servants and replaced by his son Josiah. Josiah became king, again, a good king, at the age of 8, reigned for 31 years. He did what was approved and followed in his ancestor David's footsteps. He did not deviate to the right or the left. Well, that's quite good. We'll look at more detail at him later. But it was during his reign that the scroll of the law was found in the temple, which was then read and brought about religious reform in Judah, and even incursions into what had been the northern kingdom. Notice by his point, northern kingdom's been destroyed. So he even goes up there to destroy idolatry at Bethel. And so he takes care of that. He was killed in an ill-fated attack on Pharaoh Necho at Megiddo, which was again in the north. So he went after him, and we'll study that later. It's thought that Jeremiah began prophesying during his reign, continued until Jerusalem was destroyed and beyond. And Nahum may have also been written during his reign. And it's thought that Zephaniah was written during his reign as well. It was during Josiah's reign that Assyria was finally defeated. And do I have a line on that one? I do. Assyria was finally defeated by a combined Mede and Babylonian army. So at that point, Babylon is now your main world power. We'll talk more about that later as well. He's succeeded by his son Jehoahaz, who reigned for a total of 3 months. Short-lived reign. He did evil in the sight of the Lord as his ancestors had done, 2 Kings 23. He was taken captive, imprisoned by Pharaoh Necho, who then put his brother Eliakim on the throne and changed his name to Jehoiakim and imposed a tax on the land of Judah. Jehoiakim reigned for 11 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord as his ancestors had done, and during his reign, Babylon attacked, and we have the first of the deportations to Babylon. Daniel would have been part of that one. And Judah came under the rule of Babylon. Perhaps Habakkuk dates from his reign. And of course, Daniel's also begins to take place during that reign. He dies, was replaced by his son Jehoiakim. Now, Jehoiakim ruled for 3 months. And it says he did evil in the sight of the Lord as his ancestors had done. How can you reign 3 months and do evil? I mean, he managed to do it. So there you go. He's taken to Babylon during the second deportation, and his uncle Mattaniah was placed on the throne as a puppet king for Nebuchadnezzar, and his name was changed to Zedekiah. By the way, it's the third of Joash's sons on the throne. So he had 2 sons and a grandson who ruled. Ezekiel, by the way, was taken into exile during that second deportation. Zedekiah then was on the throne for 11 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord as Jehoiakim had done. It was during his time that the final deportation took place. Jerusalem was destroyed, and he was also taken to Babylon. If Obadiah was written about what Edom did when Jerusalem was attacked by Nebuchadnezzar, then it would place him during this time period. So there's your chronology. Fun, isn't it? Actually, I love it. It's great stuff. So we will be making, in my lessons, we'll be making reference to this because it's, once you outline it, you might as well leave it. So we'll make reference to that. That way you can sort of place what's going on, where people are coming in, and whatnot. So hopefully that's maybe of some use in seeing how all of this is corresponding. The one thing I could have added to this, which would be useful, is Assyria, but just keep in mind that Assyria is active from someplace up in there to here, and then Babylon's the world power from here, though Babylon starts a bit further back, but we'll find out about that tomorrow.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting that in the southern kingdom in Judah, there are a lot more good kings than bad kings.
Yeah, at least some degree of goodness.
Yeah, I mean, in terms
Yeah.
of how you've laid it
Yeah.
out, there are,
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
are a lot.
I noticed that when I did that. And it's interesting, we should have maybe had a third color, and that being the ones who were the ones that were like David.
Yeah.
But there's some who are faithful but not eliminating the idolatry, and some that were faithful in eliminating the idolatry. So yeah, maybe I should have had a third one. But listen, I spent all afternoon on that one day, so I thought, no, that's going to stand as is. So.
Yeah, the confusion always has been for me is the way that they change their names.
Oh yeah.
It's just.
And you'll have it right here, it's one name, and then it changes the name here. It's still talking about the same guy.
Yeah.
And Uzziah and Amaziah, I think it's Amaziah, is really a confusing one. Because it's not even, I mean, Jehoash and Joash you can sort of work with, but I think it's Ahaziah or Amaziah. Ahaziah? I think it is. No, Amaziah. No, Ahaziah. Whatever it is. And Uzziah, that becomes confusing. See, I'm already confused. So, yeah, it's all there. So, interesting, we do have archaeology on a lot of these kings, which is very useful. But before we get to that, I will show you a bit of archaeology. There's dynasties going on here, okay? It's all framed in a dynastic framework, okay? The southern dynasty was the house of David, okay? We knew nothing outside the Bible about the house of David until 1993. So that's fairly recent. And that's when they discovered this. This is called the Tel Dan stele, I think some of them have on it. And it's a stone set up by a Damascus king to commemorate his victory over 2 kings who were his enemy. And in this stone is the inscription, and it's right there. You see they've sort of filled it in so we can read it. And it translates as the house of David.
We're
So
looking at this in the archaeology bit.
I was hoping we would. I'm going to mention archaeology anyway. We're going to overlap, so don't worry about it.
And we
Yeah.
also mentioned this last year.
We did. Yes, we did.
Because it is very significant.
Yeah, it's significant. Go ahead.
The timeline, I'm a little bit confused by one at the bottom.
What's that? Sorry?
Just on the timeline, at the bottom you've got...
Oh, sorry. I've got to go through all the whole thing, so sorry about that.
But when you get to Uzziah at the bottom, in 2 Kings chapter 15, it says Uzziah came to be king when Jeroboam's 27th year was reign. On the...
Let's see if we have overlapping, right?
You've got it overlapping, but in the next verse it says he became king when he was 16.
Yeah.
So if you look at that, it doesn't see the Uzziah and the Jeroboam at the top,
Yeah.
don't seem to match up.
It may be depending on whether they're taking it from when he was recognized as co-regent or recognized as only king. And that may be the difference. I'm not sure.
He was only 16, so
Yeah.
if you counted,
Yeah.
by looking at that, it looks like it's more than 16 years
Yeah.
there.
That's the best I can come up with, just trying to align the dates. So that's Thiel's reckoning as well.
Okay.
So, but we got to keep in mind it's not always strict chronology as we would like it. that they do mention other bits and bobs, which doesn't help a lot. We're almost there. We're almost there. I forgot that when you. I can get you a copy of that as a PDF or a JPEG, something like that. Yeah. Yeah, I found it useful. Again, based on Thiel's research. And you can find Thiel, by the way, go into Wikipedia, look up Mysterious Number of the Kings, and it'll have the reigns outlined for you.
Where you put Uzziah there, is that literally from when he was born?
That's probably from when he was co-regent.
The gap.
Yeah. So it's probably a co-regency there, from what I understand.
If that's right, then that would the start of Uzziah's reign that you've got there would be from when he was born. Because it says here that he was 16 when he became king. So if that's the case, then the cut-off with Amaziah and Uzziah would be when he was 16 when he became king on his own.
Of course, keep in mind, well, I don't think he became 16 king on his own. I think it's a problem.
That could be when he became co-regent.
Co-regent.
It says he was 16 when he became king.
Yeah.
So
But-
you're saying 16 when at the start of the time?
No, 16 from there.
Yeah.
From the first bit?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that's the way we should interpret it. The
Okay.
problem is it doesn't recognize co-regencies in the text. It just recognizes
I wasn't
reigns.
sure if you meant he was
Yeah.
16 where Amaziah died, or 16 at the
No,
start of his...
16 where Uzziah starts there.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go. Sorry about that. Sorry about
No,
that.
that's right, I was just confused.
Yeah. No, listen, if you don't think this is confusing, yeah, absolutely. But anyway, this stone dates from about 800s BC. And due to its being sealed off by a layer of Assyrian destruction, it would date this stone to about 733, 732. So the destruction. So it all works out good. But as Monty White says, this is incontrovertible proof that King David is not some mythical monarch, but a real king who existed in history and whose kingdom was known about by those who lived shortly after him. So House of David was known. So as far as the dynasty is concerned, the southern kingdom had one dynasty. That's the House of David. That was it. It didn't matter if the kings were assassinated, that lineage continued, except that one brief period of Athaliah usurping the throne. And despite all the kings not being faithful to God, God did withhold punishing the nation for the longest time. We find statements in the text like this: "But the Lord was unwilling to destroy Judah. He preserved Judah for the sake of his servant David, to whom he had promised a perpetual dynasty." So that comes up in the text quite a bit. He's withholding punishment until under Manasseh it just gets beyond redemption. And that's when he says, no, we're going to end this. By the way, both David and Ahaziah are mentioned on this, but I'm sure Patrick will go into much more detail about that. Let me just mention these quickly, let Patrick talk about them later. This seal is in the Israel Museum, and its plaque states, "Here brought the bones of Uzziah, king of Judah." I like this one. Do not open. So apparently they moved the cemetery. They moved the royal kings, and they reburied him. It says, don't touch this one. I thought that was good. I loved this one. That is called a bulla. Again, Patrick will talk about that, but references Hezekiah. We've got Taylor Prism, which references Hezekiah. Patrick will know a whole lot more about that. But this is a map. This is a time genealogy I found from Wikipedia. So it's free to use. So you can find that one. I found that useful. It shows the kings and the dynasty, although they're not totally in sync here. But nevertheless, it's close, because you've got the kings of Israel just died out just before the kings of Judah, and actually several hundred years. So it's not quite that. But we've got different dynasties. In the north, we've got the one dynasty in the south. In the north, we've got the first dynasty, Jeroboam's, okay? Second dynasty is Baasha's. The third dynasty, 7 days, Zimri. We've got the Omri dynasty. Now, that was quite a big one. It had quite a few there. We've got Jehu's dynasty. Look at that one. That's the longest serving dynasty in the north. And then, of course, Shallum's very, very short. And then we've got Menahem and his son. And then we've got Pekah, a short one as well. No, Pekah was a longer one because it overlapped those. And then Hoshea, which is about 9 years. So they had about 9 different dynasties in the north. So that was sort of the framework. So although it was set up really to go father to son, every time they're assassinated, that was it, and they'd start a new one. So all of that. By the way, of note to me, 19 kings in the north. In the south, counting Athaliah, 19 rulers. So there's 19 in both. So there's your magic number. So there you go. Went through all of that. And then, of course, there's a number of kings we've got archaeology on. But I'm going to let Patrick do that because he's going to spend some time on archaeology. So, and we'll see loads of pictures, I'm hoping, as well. So anyway, it's 1 o'clock. It's time to stop. So, questions, comments, observations? You're overwhelmed by chronology now. Yeah. I find, for me, I'm a timeline person. I'm very Western.
You have to have a chart.
Yeah. And I find when you have a chart, then you can read it, you can sort of figure out who's who, who's where, what's going on, where the prophets are coming in. I find that useful. So that's why I did that. But you're welcome to anything I produce.
The problem is we're seeing it through 21st century Western eyes. Different culture, different time.
Well, yeah, that
We
does.
want it to be the way we do it, but it doesn't work.
Yeah, and it really, it doesn't. So, but we'll see a lot more archaeology. The archaeology is fun. So we'll see a lot more of that as we go as well. Anyway, it is 1 o'clock. It is lunchtime. So stretch your legs, stretch your mind, relax your mind. We'll come back this afternoon.